We are going off to Japan, where the Financial Services Agency has flagged Bybit, BitForex, MEXC Global, and Bitget via a warning letter. The notice says that the four exchanges are in violation of the country's fund settlement laws by conducting crypto asset exchange business without registration. Sounds familiar. Separately, the Japanese Prime Minister is hosting this year's G7 summit, which will have a focus on tightening global crypto regulations. Ben, I'm going to toss this one off to you. Are you surprised to see this out of Japan this morning?
Not at all, actually. And Japan is an interesting case of regulation. It's often held up as a country that's further ahead than other jurisdictions in regulating crypto and regulating particular exchanges, because obviously this goes right back to Mt. Gox, which was the first big hack in crypto history. At the time, in 2014, roughly, about 70% of Bitcoin was transacted over Mt. Gox, and then there was a massive failure of that exchange. And that led to regulators in Japan putting together a bunch of regulations that are seen as a template for other countries to adopt worldwide, including the US. There was another big hack in 2017, CoinCheck, which I think it was the biggest ever. So I'm not surprised to see this happening because regulators there are clearly on the case, and there's clear regulatory guidelines as to what is and what isn't acceptable in the management of exchanges. So not surprised at all.
Yeah, picking up where Ben left off there, I think the Mt. Gox thing is instructive, right? Since Mt. Gox was based in Japan, Mark Capellas was based in Japan, like they sort of set the regulatory framework pretty early on, as opposed to other countries, particularly in the US, right? Like we're always talking on this show about like, when is the SEC or the CFTC or another regulatory body in the United States going to come up with actually defined granular details on how cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency exchanges should be operated and regulated? Japan already did that quite a while ago, so it's been pretty easy to understand what is okay there and what is not okay there. And they're also seemingly pretty on the beat in terms of like handing out fines or handing out warnings to people who are not acting within those rules. And I'm just saying that from a headline and layman opinion, not someone who necessarily follows Japan's regulatory stance on crypto that closely. But historically, that's what I've seen quite often, is they've been on the beat quite a bit. One thing I do want to bring up here is like we have these three exchanges and they're pretty no name. Like the only one I've really heard of out of these three or four is Bybit. But that doesn't mean that the whole area isn't having some sort of change right now. So the biggest headline most recently is Coinbase decided to start winding down its operations in the region back in January. And users of Coinbase Japan had until February to basically liquidate all their assets or get them off the exchange before Coinbase was going to permanently shut it down. So people are leaving the area right now because of the regulatory crackdown. The rules and guidelines are there, but they can always be enforced or be more strictly enforced or read a little bit differently than they were in the past based on what's occurred. I think FTX was the thing that occurred in the past. Last bit here before I throw it back to you, Jen, is FTX Japan. And in that Chapter 11 case, they were able to give back their assets almost one-to-one for every single customer of FTX Japan because that entity had to follow the regulatory stance of Japan, which means that everything had to be backed up and everything had to be checked with the regulators. So we do see like a very strong regulatory stance in Japan, which forces some people to get warnings or forces some businesses to shut down. But in the case of Chapter 11 and for customers, it seems to be a good thing. Back to you, Jen.
Yeah, well, you took what I was going to say about FTX Japan. So they were among the first customers to get some of their money back in the FTX debacle. When I look at the story, if I zoom out a little bit, right, we recently spoke about exchanges thinking about how they're going to operate in Canada. I think Binance, in that article that we spoke about last week, said, well, they didn't say this. Someone with information said that it looks like Binance might be leaving Canada. We see exchanges in the US trying to kind of figure out how to step around all of the subpoenas that are going out with this very unclear regulation. And now we have four exchanges hit with this warning letter in Japan. I feel like, when we talk about US regulation, we talk about exchanges moving away to get away from this tightening of regulation. And now it just looks like all of the other countries are looking at what's happening in North America and doing something quite similar. Ben, I'm going to toss this back to you, or Will, you can answer as well. Do you think that this kind of global tightening of restrictions when it comes to centralized exchanges is going to really change the way that we look and we interact with crypto?
I should throw it over to Ben for his take. It's going to be better than mine.
Well, I think there's a big question now about the US crypto industry, whether it's going to leave the US because of the regulatory uncertainty. And it isn't necessarily because of a crackdown. It's really because a lot of companies just don't know where they stand because we have enforcement. We have regulation by enforcement rather than regulation by clear guidance. So if you're operating here, according to these companies, it's just not clear what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And that just leads to high legal costs, high compliance costs, and no certainty that you're going to be, not held up by regulator at some point. So that's why companies are leaving, not necessarily because of a crackdown, but because of the uncertainty.